So if I'm ordering these correctly, my last video was on the frustration of the demands for civility in discourse with people who don't want to listen to you and who just want to basically be hostile and defensive and shout you down for views that you may or may not, in some of the cases I gave as examples, probably don't share. And while this is a video that I've wanted to do for a while and is an individual topic of its own, there is an element here that ties right back into the idea that it's not just conservatives who can be hostile and make front-loaded assumptions and refuse to listen. And because this is probably going to go to places where I talk about at least mentioning rape and violence against LGBT individuals, and possibly more so, I'm just going to throw up a warning in advance that this may go to places that are going to be problematic for certain people. You have been warned. As I mentioned in my last video, there are certain words that I avoid on this channel, and generally avoid in discussion on the principle that they tend to have an inflammatory effect. Words like feminism, because people will automatically react poorly to them. However, there are words, or at least one word that I can think of, that people react poorly to if you don't use. And it's kind of an interesting case for me, because the word in question is queer. There's a lot of side avenues I could go down at this point, but yeah, I want to get into the main issue that I have in the first place, because for me, queer is definitely a slur, and this does not come out of the blue. This is not some random idea that I just came up with one day, or because I heard, like, anti-LGBT propaganda or whatever. No, for me, queer represents a reason that I got the shit kicked out of me from the age of, like, 6 or maybe even 5. It represents being put in the hospital for being queer. It represents being physically and sexually assaulted for being queer. People who try to rape the queer out of me. I don't know that I can possibly be more clear about this topic than to say it directly and very, very assertively like that. This is difficult for me to talk about on many levels, but part of it is simply because it is so viscerally associated with trauma, and not just any trauma, but a trauma that I was unable to, or felt unable to talk about for decades, that festered for decades, that I am only dealing with currently now, after decades. Did I mention decades? And an interesting thing about this is, despite all of that, all the baggage that goes along with this, the fact that I have literal PTSD because I was nearly killed for being queer, despite all of that, I get put into the hostile camp by the supposed LGBT community and allies. It is really surreal to be part of a community that is supposedly supportive and yet demands that you say things that you're uncomfortable with. People who demand you call them queer. People who demand you say LGBTQ or LGBTQI. Or people who just will drop you into the antagonist pile because you have decided that a word that to you represents the people who did you harm for decades. Yes, I will keep using that word. And what it basically comes down to is that they really, really want to use the word, and it doesn't matter if other people are uncomfortable with it. A lot of these people will go as far as to say, well, you're queer, deal with it. And that is inherently disrespectful from a group of people who are supposedly supportive of one another, because they're immediately excluding me. Ironically, excluding me from what is supposed to be an umbrella term. And that's where all of this really falls apart for me, because there's one argument that you can make for queer as a personal identity. There's another entirely when you start demanding other people use it as an umbrella term, or you insist on labeling other people with a word, completely disrespecting their own wishes. But time and time again, I have seen the air quotes queer community go after people who are uncomfortable with the word queer, including myself, by claiming that we are biphobic or transphobic or hate non-binary people, that we're trying to erase everyone but the cis gay and cis lesbians, and in fact I must either be a cis het male or a cis lesbian, and I don't know how you reconcile those two things. And part of the problem is that I'm really not alone in this. There are a lot of people out there who are uncomfortable with the use of the word queer, period, but especially as an umbrella label for a bunch of people who, might not want to be called queer. And the interesting thing is that this really does seem to come from the same place as when a lot of conservatives are called out on their behavior. I don't want to modify the way I act, so you must be the problem. In this case, it's you must be like cishet or cisgay or whatever words they want to use, which is ironic because I don't fit into either fucking category. And it's especially frustrating because it often comes from people who have been alive for less time than I have been the subject of violence. And they're telling me that, I just don't understand that it's been reclaimed and that there's no damage done. I'm sorry, but my therapist bills say otherwise. And the interesting irony is that a good number of people who make this argument were I to use a different word. And to be honest, I can only think of one other word that would cause me to react anywhere near as badly, and that's faggot, because it's one of the ones that was most commonly used on me as I was being put in the hospital. The argument would flip on a dime. Suddenly it would be, well, words have weight to them. Words are harmful. This is a word that has been used to oppress a lot of LGBT people, or LGBTQ people, as they would all most certainly insist. I've even been called a queerphobe before, and I could be glib and sarcastic about it, but the honest thing is that technically it's true. Pretty much every person I've ever come across who identifies as queer gets hostile and angry if you don't want to use the word, or if you don't want to use the word on them. If you don't want to use a word that you have trouble even saying out loud, this is not an easy video for me to make. The problem is that they also want to follow in baggage that they've front-loaded into that. The idea that I hate LGBT people, which would be really awkward, or the idea that I want to erase the existence of transgender, bisexual, or non-binary people, which would be especially awkward because I'm two of those categories, for fuck's sake. But the end result for me, because of this automatic defensiveness and hostility, is that I not only feel disconnected from queers, and this does not serve as a good representation for how queer is a good thing, I also feel disconnected from the general LGBT population because they have a tendency to sit back and let this happen. To watch queer people abuse LGBT individuals simply for the fact that they have been abused, the fact that I have lived with abuse and hate and violence and trauma at the hands of people using words like this. And they can understand it for pretty much everyone else, but they cannot apply that empathy when it's a word that they really, really want to use. I don't have a good ending for this video. I don't have anything clever to say. I don't have any sort of way to tie this back to the beginning because I just want it to be over. This is a tiring subject for me, one that I don't want to keep going back to, and yet one that in any conversation with the LGBT community I'm very likely to have to revisit. And as such, I find myself further and further distanced from the group that is supposedly accepting of me, welcoming of me, supportive of me, and yes, who wants to include me in their big queer umbrella. And yeah, that last take was kind of hostile, and I was tempted to cut it entirely, but I kind of want to leave it in now because it does kind of go back to a point from my last video. It's frustrating dealing with people who preload these assumptions, who make these accusations, who are hostile, and not only just hostile, but unwilling to change their hostility no matter the circumstance. It is incredibly frustrating. It is tiresome. It is outrageous to tell people about the hurt, the violence, the abuse in your life, the near-death experiences, the trauma, and to have them still decide that, well, you just hate LGBT people because you don't want to say queer. Because the reality is that I have the feeling that that big queer umbrella has been used to push me out of the space which I ostensibly belong, where people supposedly accept and support me. And part of the problem is that being without that support is incredibly dangerous for LGBT individuals and especially trans individuals, because lack of support is one of those big instigating factors for suicidal urges, depression, anxiety. It really, really sucks to be alone. And it sucks worse when it's your own community that pushed you out. And I guess I did have an ending for this after all. Thanks for listening. Amaranth out.